Alright, welcome back to True Eagle. Today I'm going to be kicking off a new series where I'm going to go through each of my favourite Eagles seasons and relive some of the best memories we've had from a given year. Now in my head, there are a couple seasons outside the two premierships that I've seen in 06 and 2018. Obviously they're probably going to feature as part of this series, but I also wanted to highlight some of the seasons where we didn't win premierships that were still really enjoyable seasons. And there's, out of the last 20 years of being an Eagles fan, I don't think there's too many that fit that criteria. But the first one I'm going to do in this series is 2011, which was just an amazing ride, and I think you had to be an Eagles fan at the time to truly understand that. So today's video is going to be a 2011 rewind, looking back at what made that season so great for Eagles fans. Now I'm recording this prior to round one, and part of me is wondering, am I doing this because Eagles fans need something to enjoy during this process of a lengthy rebuild? It could be partially that, but I also wanted to make something a little bit unique and different to what's out there. And while there's some great Eagles content out there, I thought I would take a little bit of a different angle for this series. So let me know in the comments what you think of this concept. Okay, 2011, what made it so great? Well, we're going to go through that, but it's important to set the context for 2011. So 2010, we had just won the club's first ever wooden spoon. It was a horrifically disappointing season. We ended 2009 in pretty good shape, only for 2010 to turn out to be a bit of a train wreck. And I do remember we did have some injuries, and the players that we did have were underdone, and it was a shallow list because we were still going through a rebuild. So what would unfold in 2011 will really be quite unforeseen. We did have some aging veterans, the hangers-on from the 2006 Premiership team. I mean, Darren Glass, Dean Cox, Daniel Kerr were still on the list, but to different extents, they were all injury-prone. We couldn't get the decent players we had fit and firing. Daniel Kerr in particular, I remember a horrific injury in 2010. He tore a hamstring off the bone, but he was just injury-prone the entire time through that rebuild. Mark Nikoski was another one. Good player in that previous era, but had been permanently injured since. Even Embley, there was a lot of criticism on Andrew Embley going into 2011, and it was suggested that he was past his best, which ultimately he proved that claim very, very wrong. We had some decent experienced players going to that year, guys like Bo Waters and Sam Butler. Both of them were famously injured for most of their careers. Even I remember Shannon Hearn, at least in 2010, I think he had spent some time injured. So what we did have at the time is a young nucleus of guys like Nick Nat Nui. He hadn't quite established himself at AFL level yet, but he had produced a lot of different highlights. Josh Kennedy had obviously been on the list for a few years, but well and truly had not made his mark on the AFL yet. And the other youngsters that we were hoping would take us to the next level, Scott Selwood, Chris Maston, Brad Ebert, Kobe Stevens. Brad Shepard had just been drafted a year prior to that as well and shown some decent form. But at the center of the team, there was a big criticism of this team's midfield. And Matt Priddis, who had been, a bit of a workhorse, but really didn't have any support around him. Adam Selwood was still taking a lot of midfield minutes. We just didn't quite have the talent in that group to that point. And Luke Shuey had played 6 games, and really, we didn't know exactly what sort of player he was going to be, although those who were following it closely did think that Luke Shuey had a lot of talent. So that more or less sets the context for us going into 2011. And on top of winning the wooden spoon, it was also the first year that the AFL was expanding with Gold Coast, and there was a heavily compromised draft. So even though we won the wooden spoon, we only got pick 4. Our priority pick that year for being so bad ended up being pick 26, but we did add Andrew Gaff, Jack Darling, Scott Lysett, and then I think we rookie drafted Jeremy McGovern, so it turned out to be a great year for the draft. But anyway, expectations were low. We were largely picked to be a bottom 4 team that year, and then in round 1 we played North Melbourne, who I think had finished 9th the previous year. We played them at Subiaco Oval. Gaff debuts as a sub, Darling's also debuting, and Shuey's playing his 7th game, but it kind of feels like a debut because he had spent so much of the first couple of years on the list injured. But we came out and won, unexpectedly. Priddis was one of the best on field. Andrew Embley also was outstanding in that first game. Nikoski was reinvented as a forward, having played most of his career as a halfback flanker. I remember he kicked 2 goals, 5 in this game. And while we didn't necessarily think this was going to foreshadow an amazing season, it just felt good to win. And in the second round, we went to Amy Stadium. We played Port Adelaide, again, a game where we were heavily underdogs. And then we went and he stunned Port Adelaide, who'd finished 10th on the ladder the previous year. For me, the thing I remember about this game was this was probably Luke Shuey's first breakout game. He kicked 3 goals and had 27 touches. Pretty sure he got his Rising Star nomination from that game, but looking back on the stats, he wasn't even best on ground. Andrew Embley had 4 goals and 32 touches in this game. Josh Kennedy kicked 3, and the Eagles were 2-0, and that felt like a huge deal. It was described on Big Footy at the time as being a season-defining win, and there was no mistaking it now. We had massively improved. We then had 2 tough tests after that. We lost to Sydney at home by 13 points. Then we went and played Hawthorn in Tasmania. Buddy Franklin kicked 6 on us, but we only lost the game by 7 points. It was still a very amicable effort considering Hawthorn finished 3rd that year. But that was the game I do remember that Dwayne Russell decided to throw into the commentary that there was some sort of tanking debate about the West Coast Eagles tanking for Jack Darling, even though that happened to be pick 26. And it was also definitely not a debate. He just randomly decided to throw that into the commentary. I'll never forget that. And Dwayne Russell was probably the most annoying thing about the 2011 season. We seemed to have him commentating a lot. But I do remember Darling playing well that day, and he had 24 touches. You know, it was a very different player when he first started. He was more like a pressure forward who could obviously clunk a mark, but some of his rundown tackles, that was his one wood when he first joined the Eagles. Then we absolutely smoked Melbourne at Subiaco Oval. I remember prior to that season thinking there was a chance we were going to get belted in that game because Melbourne fans were selling us about this future of Cale Morton and Tom Scully taking them to the next level. Jack Grimes as well. So that felt really good. There was a bit of a Eagles big footy rivalry with Melbourne at the time. I spent a lot of time in Bay 13. If you're on big footy, you'll know what that means. And then we had a tough away game to Essendon, and Essendon was actually pretty good. They were top 4 in the first 7 rounds of that season, and there was a little bit of a rivalry between us and them purely on the basis that Dyson Heppel and Luke Shuey were kind of emerging as the favourites for the Rising Star Award. But we lost that game. They were the better side on the day. We're 3-3, and to be honest, we're still feeling pretty okay because we've almost won as many games as we did the previous season in the first 6 weeks. Then there was the Derby. And this probably is my favourite Derby ever, actually. Freo was 6th, we were 10th, and we hadn't won a Derby since 2007. And to be honest, the biggest memory I have from that game is Nat Fyfe's insane left-footed check side banana. That was kind of around the time that he was announcing himself as, you know, a potential superstar, and he would eventually become that. He had 2 goals and 28 touches, but who cares? We're talking about the Eagles here. But we just had their measure from the entire game. It was 9 goals to 3 at half-time. We ended up winning the game by 33 points, and gee, it really does feel good to snap a long Derby streak. Both sets of fans can relate to that feeling. Then there was the famous Western Bulldogs game, and I say famous, I put it in my top 10 Eagles memories the other day, and for a few reasons. So we played the Bulldogs, who had finished 4th the previous season, playing them at Subiaco Oval. I don't think they had a great year that year, but either way, nobody saw this result coming. Kennedy kicked 10 goals, Luke Shuey kicked 5 goals and had 27 possessions, Andrew Embley had 34 touches, 2 goals, Scott Selwood had 14 tackles, and we just mauled the Western Bulldogs. We beat them by over 20 goals. That was our biggest ever win against the Bulldogs, and just looked so different to what we as Eagles fans had become accustomed to seeing. So just like that, we were 5 wins and 3 losses. Our percentage was 131%, and we were in 6th position. This just seemed too good to be true and was wildly unpredicted. And then we had a big test, and it was a testament to how exciting the Eagles were at that time, in that when we played Collingwood at the MCG in I think round 10, obviously they were the reigning premier, the premiership favourite that year as well, we were considered a chance to knock them off, which seemed crazy when I think 12 months previous we literally lost the game by 100 points. So at this point, I'll try and break down why the Eagles sort of emerged as a pretty damn good team in the first 9 weeks of that season, having won the Wooden Spoon before. The first one that we have to mention is the innovative forward press. And I say innovative, we kind of adapted what Collingwood were renowned for, their forward press, where every single player on the field would become a defender at some point. And now that's really commonplace. A really dedicated forward line to pressuring the opposition's defenders. It was something that Collingwood had obviously innovated and we'd adapted it, and ours was just about as good as theirs that year. Guys like Nikoski and Darling as well. In particular, I remember them as pressure forwards doing a really good job. Then there was the better availability and the fitness of some mature players. So Daniel Kerr, in particular, Kerr I think was a huge in. That year he was our best midfielder. You know, statistically it might be Pritis, it could even be Shuey, but Daniel Kerr, having had so many injuries over the previous years, came in and just played within his limits. You know, he played limited time on ground. He was very much an inside player, and the clearances he would win and the handballs he used to get out, stats don't tell the story. Daniel Kerr was unreal that year, and probably the biggest single factor, but it was a multitude of factors. Mark Nikosi reinventing himself as a forward, Shannon Hearn, Sam Butler, Bo Waters staying fit, Josh Kennedy also taking his game to the next level. Then you also had some veterans in there like Dean Cox and Darren Glass, and Cox and Nat Nui as a duo. Again, that was probably the best version we'd seen of them up until that point. But then also the introduction of some younger players who had some class and outside speed, in particular Luke Shuey and Andrew Gaff. We had a lot of the inside pieces, you know, Pritis and Selwood, they could win clearances, and then as soon as the ball would exit the stoppage, we'd kind of be screwed. It's starting to sound a little bit similar to today, hey. But Gaff and Shuey just stuck out like dog's balls, and it was just so many different factors, but I've tried to encapsulate it as best as I can. So then we would take on Collingwood in round 10, and we failed that test. We came up short, but that was okay. because it was by far our biggest test of the year that season. I think we lost it by about 52 points. And that's to be expected. Young side gets schooled by quality opposition. We kind of stuttered after this Collingwood game, a little bit of a form slump, but we still kept winning, which was impressive. So we had our first ever game against the Gold Coast Suns. We won that game by 18 points. We should have won by more considering how bad Gold Coast were in their first season, but that's all right. And then we have the Adelaide game at Amy Stadium, and I gotta say, this is rare, but I don't remember this game. I think I remember every other game that season, but I don't remember us beating Adelaide, but they finished bottom 4, and then we played Port at home. They would end up finishing bottom 2, and we only won by 20 points. So it was kind of a mixed feeling. We were a little bit frustrated at the time because our expectations had been blown out of the water, but we were still accumulating the wins, and that was all that was important. And that leads us to the Carlton game, and this could easily be a top 10 Eagles memory for me. I didn't include it, but I possibly should have. We played Carlton, and the narrative between us and Carlton, again, a little bit of a rivalry there brewing because we were both kind of vying to be the 4th best team in the comp. And I seem to remember a huge amount of arrogance from Carlton fans, and I'm sure they will say the same thing about Eagles fans. I think there was massive amounts of arrogance both sides. But there was also, don't forget, the Chris Judd narrative. Chris Judd had left West Coast to join Carlton. We'd fallen in a heap. Carlton had started to improve. And then we met at Marvel Stadium, and neither sets of fans, I think, truly respected the other. So to get up in this game by 6 goals, absolutely cream them for the most part. I think it did get close in the third quarter, and then we just kicked away. Nak Nui took mark of the year. This felt so good. One of my favourite Eagles home and away wins ever. Then there was a bye, and then we would have probably the next biggest test of the season. So in about a 5 or 6 week period, we had a little bit of a tough fixture, and we passed one against Carlton. We possibly failed one against Collingwood. Then we took on Geelong at Subiaco Oval. Geelong would eventually win the premiership this year. This was a seriously tough test. I remember 3 years prior to this, we lost this game by 135 points. So this would have been a massive tick, a massive sign of legitimacy if we could at least match it or beat Geelong. And they did get the fast start. Then we kicked a couple of unreal goals through Kennedy and Nikoski. And I do remember now, I look back on the highlights, Mark Lacroix's wearing an arm brace in these games. And I remember he actually broke his arm and just kept playing. What an absolute legend. And out of nowhere, we just kind of blew them out of the water for a little period of that game. It was 73-38, I think, at halftime. And then the Cats, as you'd expect, would make a comeback, and I think we lead by 11 at three-quarter time. It just felt like a heavyweight battle, and amazingly, we would hold on to win this game by 8 points, and you can see on the siren, the way the Eagles celebrate, this game meant a lot. The Carlton win was good in the sense that we sort of knocked off a little bit of a mini rival or a temporary rival in Carlton. There was satisfaction, but when we beat Geelong, it felt a lot more like an indication of legitimacy. I will say though, I don't know if I ever felt like we were truly contenders that year. We were certainly probably the 4th best team that year, but it felt more like we were just proving ourselves that we were not that far off the best teams when you probably consider those teams to be Collingwood, Hawthorn and Geelong that year. I remember after we beat the Cats, my dad saying to me over a meat pie for lunch, he said, now that we've beaten Carlton and Geelong, we're going to lose a game you didn't expect us to lose. And I remember thinking, nah. And to be honest, a week later, he was right. We took on St Kilda at Etihad Stadium on a Saturday night, where they were famously good, particularly on Saturday nights. There was some sort of weird stat, but the Saints had really struggled that year after losing last year's grand final, and they pulled out one of their best performances that year and beat us by 4 goals, and that was really frustrating. It would, however, be the last home and away game we would lose for that season, but that's not to say there weren't still blips. I think the week after that, that was the famous derby where Ballantyne misses on the siren. One thing that gets lost about that, I don't actually like watching that game back, is because we led by about 20 points in a low-scoring game with about 5 minutes to go, Fremantle nearly came back and won, so it was more just relief when we won. Then the week after that, we got out to a 50-point lead against the Dogs at Etihad, only to then almost lose the game and win by 8 points. And that's okay, we're still winning, and ultimately that's all that counts, but it wasn't completely smooth sailing. So we kind of cruised for the rest of the home and away season, end up finishing 4th. I think if we'd beaten St Kilda, we might have finished 3rd. I think we were clearly the 4th best team in the comp, but like I said, the Pies, the Cats, and the Hawks still felt like they were well and truly more seasoned than this young West Coast group. So we took on the Pies in a qualifying final, and you know what? This game was quite an honourable loss. When you consider we lost the first fixture to them by about 53 points, you have the rematch something like 2 or 3 months later. Qualifying final, first final for a lot of these young Eagles. We only go down down by about 20 points in the end. So I think that in itself was really good experience and a really good indication of improvement from half a season. Then we had the famous semi-final against Carlton. And this is probably one of my favorite, finals wins we've ever had. And now that's tough because they're all good, aren't they? But to Carlton's credit, this was a much tougher game than what we would have at Marvel earlier that year. I think they kicked 4 of the first 5 goals at quarter time. Then we kicked 8 goals to 3 in the second term. And I think we're narrowly in front at half time. But this game was an absolute arm wrestle. And in some ways we were lucky to win. Carlton had a few injuries and they fought bravely. It was a really, really good game of footy. Then we would get out to a 3 or 4 goal lead. I remember a McGinnity soccer to almost seal the game. Carlton then kind of came back, kicked a few late goals, and this game got way closer than it should have been. And it was just when the siren goes and we win, that was just pure relief. And I'm not gonna lie, I like Chris Judd. Now that we reflect on his career, now that he's retired, it's nice to embrace him again as an Eagle rather than just someone who betrayed us. But this period was kind of still a little bit raw. And so it felt so good to just be like, suck on these, Chris. I don't really blame him for leaving, but at the same time, it was just so beautiful to be able to say, yeah, you left us, you thought Carlton were going to be better than us, and yet we've beaten you back into the top 4. That was a nice feeling. As a 17-year-old immature young man, that felt great. Then there was a prelim final against Geelong, and this game was very much a formality. This was truly a test of the best teams of the competition, and we got a stern reminder of exactly where we were at, which doesn't mean we shouldn't be proud, but it was a very one-sided prelim. They didn't disgrace themselves, but you could just see there's levels to this game, and we were quite off being an absolute contender for the premiership. So we bow out in a prelim, and that is absolutely unbelievable. And I don't know the stats off the top of my head, but it'd have to be one of the best bounce back seasons we've seen. Only blemish from that season for me, Luke Shuey coming second in the Rising Star. I thought that was absolute bullshit. And to be fair, Dyson Heppel had a wonderful debut season. And I think what counts against Shuey was that he was technically in his 3rd year because he'd missed so much football. He was still technically eligible, but I said at the time, I was like, Shuey's going to be a much better player. And to be fair, that came true. So that caps off one of my favorite Eagles seasons ever. To summarize what I think went right for us that year, we had a healthy list for the first time. It wasn't like we had horrific injuries back then, but when we had, a young bad list and players got injured, it just made it worse. But we kept them relatively healthy. We saw some tactical innovation where we were able to adapt a new pressure game style, keeping the ball in the front half. Jack Darling, our key forward, running down defenders. We had legends winding back the clock. Dean Cox, I think Dean Cox was still pretty good that whole period. Same thing with Darren Glass, but in particular Kerr and Embley. Embley, I don't know if I've mentioned enough in this video. He had an unbelievable season. Then that sort of middle tier of players, Nikoski comes back into this team. I think he kicked 40 odd goals. Bo Waters, Sam Butler, they had barely played consistent footy after that. Even Matthew Rosa is a very honourable mention here. And then Pritis, Pritis had been a pretty consistent midfielder. There was some criticisms of him, but we saw the first time Pritis supported by other midfielders that can make his hard work look good. When Pritis is your number 1 midfielder for a number of years and he's got no support, you can understand how we became such an average team. Then Darling and Kennedy emerging as young key forward guns alongside Quinton Lynch. And then, like I said, Shuey and Gaff on the outside coming in and just giving this team a completely different look to what it had the previous 3 years. So there you have it, guys. That is my recollections of the 2011 season. Let me know in the comments any other memories that you have. Also, let me know what other seasons you want me to do. I'm recording this a month before you're going to see it. I'm going to get this to video to drop while I'm in America. So I'm thinking the next one will be 2015. But if there's any other seasons you want me to do, I'm of course going to do 06 and 2018. The tricky thing for me is that anything prior to about 2002, I'm not going to have a memory of. I can still have a crack, it just won't be quite in the same format. But for now, I hope you enjoy the video, guys. Subscribe to True Eagle if you want plenty of Eagles content, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.